Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first seminar in another season of Ethnic Researchers series on measuring progress and well-being. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. We have a great set of speakers and are looking forward to each one in this next series. In case you've missed any of the past seminars or the in-person workshop, I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel or the website. Today, we are pleased to welcome Professor Christopher Barrington-Leigh, who will discuss the World Wellbeing Panel. Chris will speak for around 40 minutes and then address questions at the end. At that time, please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And as a reminder, we are recording the event. You can find this and past recordings on our website or the YouTube channel. Now, a very quick introduction of Professor Christopher Barrington-Leigh. Chris is an associate professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where he teaches in the Beeler School of Environment and Department of Economics. His research is in diverse topics spanning subjective well-being, energy transition, and residential street network connectivity. And he is the current director of the World Wellbeing Panel, of which we're talking about today. And personally, as a relatively new member, I'm quite interested in learning more about what the panel has said in the past through numerous surveys and also some of its history. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Christopher Barrington-Leigh. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kelsey. Thank you for inviting me. Also, if I'm allowed to admit, thank you for suggesting this topic. And above all, thank you very much for convening this series. I think the Measuring Progress series has a policy slant, and that's very much the vein intended angle of the World Wellbeing Panel as well. So other caveats I should give here on the title slide, as Kelsey mentioned, I am the director. I became the director just in 2023. So I'm going to be presenting others' efforts and work and exploring them a little bit. I hope to keep this interactive and fun. And I'm not really sure how long it will go. We may have lots of time for discussion. But thank you everybody for coming, and let's get going. So for those not familiar with the World Wellbeing Panel, to cut to the chase, what do we do? Most of our activity is that we poll experts in well-being. And so here's an example of a question, fairly recent question from the poll. In my country, individuals who continue in education after compulsory education ends obtain higher lifetime well-being than they would have otherwise. Now, what we usually do, not in all of our surveys, but in most of our surveys, is that we give two questions, and it's possible to go back and forth, but they lead you down the path a little bit in the sense that the first one is a little bit more empirical research based, and the second one is often, not always, a relatively sharp policy question. So the second question in this pair, and we typically, again, not quite always, but usually solicit answers on this scale, Likert scale, from completely disagree to completely agree. And then importantly, as well as giving a categorical vote, we ask individuals to give detailed responses, text responses, as long as they like, and these are all presented with people's names for posterity. But you can't see anybody else's answer until the poll is published. So the second question in this pair was, adding a year of compulsory education would increase national well-being. So going back to this first question, notice it's asking quite explicitly about causality. It refers to a counterfactual. So, higher well-being than they would have otherwise. So it's asking something which is already requires the kind of inference tools that we like to think we have. That's because we know that schooling self-selects, and so we wouldn't, it's a less interesting question to just ask if people who have more education are happier. Interestingly enough, even that question doesn't have, the empirical answer to that question is not clear and not intuitive. The answer is often no, especially conditioning on income. But regardless, this is asking about what happens to an individual, when they either make that choice or are guided into it. And this policy question, of course, is quite different than the causal question. Policies have costs. Therefore, there are opportunity costs for society as opposed to just for the individual choosing more schooling. And there are imperfections in implementation or in the mechanisms of the policy. So we have to take away a freedom in order to get everyone to go to school. And maybe above all, this question is now asking about national well-being as opposed to individual well-being. So, well, let me state the maybe obvious on that. We are not defining these things. In fact, funnily, nowhere does from what I can see, has the World Wellbeing Panel defined well-being in its invitations or or publicity. And I'll come back a little bit to the purpose of how it got started and why it does that. But we want, in principle, to leave it up to respondents to interpret and maybe define well-being as they go. So I think we're trying to do two different things in asking questions like this. Number one is that we're pushing researchers to think about policy. And secondly, we'd like to be communicating to policymakers to think about well-being. Now, the panelists are all researchers, and so the second objective there requires getting our results, our findings out there, and getting good publicity. I'll come back to that a little bit, but I'm not sure we're excelling at that, and so I'm going to ask for suggestions at the very end for where this poll goes in the future. Yeah, so what do we do once we have the poll, which is typically out for a week? We then write it up. We not only is every detailed answer available on our website, but we also write up a synthesis. And then we try to get publicity for it, meaning maybe we issue a press release or poke it to all of our networks and hope that it catches some interest. And of course, the way to do that is to have a hook. So often the policy topic, and particularly maybe the second question of those two, is related to some ongoing current salient policy question. So this is as close as we have to defining our mission, is that the World Wellbeing Panel promotes well-being as the ultimate purpose of all major decision makers, particularly government. Now, interestingly, we don't do explicit advocacy, but I take this purpose to mean that through getting those two things that I mentioned earlier to happen, that will implicitly promote well-being in policy. However, I think that I'll come back again, our activities are not limited to just the polls, and I'll tell you about one other activity that we've undertaken, but we're not limited. Okay, and in our self-description on the website, it says we ask an international panel of experts questions of relevance to well-being policy. This poll fosters debates about policy in terms of its impacts on well-being, which over time should lead to better policies and decisions. We also don't have a great way to measure our impact from as far as I know, and that's probably something that we could work on. Let me tell you just a bit of basic history. The poll was launched in 2016 with a few characters, including Tony Beaton, who has sort of stayed on and has been helping with actually sending out the poll and doing some of the processing. Also tech support from each of the universities that's hosted it. And initially it was led by Paul Freiters. And you can actually watch a video there of that launch. And Paul continued to lead what became known as the Management Committee until 2020, when Ada took over, and then it was passed on to me in 2023. And I've revamped the website with some great help from somebody here at McGill, and it's now hosted at McGill and has this URL. So since 2017, we've conducted 35 polls, and I'll also show you later, we released a reading list in December of 2022. That effort was led by Daniela Andren. So I mentioned there's a management committee, and this is it. I don't know what I can say about diversity, except that it is it's on our mind and a challenge, both I mean a concern, I should say, both for the panelists and for the administration. What else to say about this committee? I get up at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. For meetings to optimize the time zones between Montreal, Saudi Arabia, New Zealand, and Australia for our meetings. And what else? Well, here are our current panelists. So there are 58 people. That's maybe a little. In fact, we advertise as having 40 to 50 on the panel. So we are have a good population at the moment. We think about gender balance and diversity. I should say that, you know, when in Paul's, if you watch that video, Paul is quite ambitious about the future potential. So he says, look, we're explicitly starting with, we're acknowledging that we're starting with an Anglo-weighted panel, but ideally this will grow considerably and actually could split to have, you know, regional panels, maybe not by topic, but certainly, let's say, by geography. And I'll tell you, yeah, I'm going to tell you. Well, I'll make mention later of actually an inspiration for this panel, which is that something like this already exists in economics, and so this is actually modeled after a series of panels that are housed at the University of Chicago, and these are on general economic policy topics. And so there's one for the US, and there's one for Europe, and there's one on finance, and maybe one or two others. And they have somewhat similar structure. So our panel includes economists, sociologists, behavioral scientists, and public policy experts from quite a few different countries. Many of them are economists. That's probably the largest contingent. And what happens when you get invited to join this panel, each poll is optional. So you get an invitation each time, and you don't have to respond. There's no compensation either. And really the criteria for membership are just having, you know, made a significant contribution, major contribution to the academic literature on subjective well-being. And again, that is not even explicit on our webpage, that when we say well-being, we're talking about subjective well-being. But that is the all of these panelists have contributed to that subjective well-being literature. So that doesn't mean that everyone on the panel has a definition of well-being or collective well-being, or what policy should target that is uniform. But what sets this panel apart from other economics panels is our orientation to subjective well-being as an overarching insight into how good life is. For fun, because, you know, I had the opportunity in giving this talk, I made a leaderboard. This is the number of contributions, number of responses that some of our panelists have given, going down to 10. And here are a few panelists who have gone quiet, and so they're no longer listed as active panelists. And I said we're almost, I don't know if we're overpopulated, but the panel is fairly full at the moment. And so, but we retire people who have not been active recently and send out invitations somewhat regularly. So, so that you can experience the challenge of being a panelist, I thought that I would replay a few of the questions from our past. And so a simple way to do this would just be to type your answer to this question into the chat, and don't press enter yet. And I will, so you can go ahead and do that now. So the question is, do you think that populations on average have higher well-being during major festive periods like Christmas? And I'm going to, my intent here was to type a question, I see. I'm going to type festive periods, and then as soon as that's in, everybody can type their answer. Now, I suggest you just type agree or disagree, or you could have an extremes. And then if you have a follow-up detailed answer, type that again as a separate comment. This talk is going to be largely an advertisement for going and looking into the archive of past panels, because it's very difficult for me to capture the nuance and subtlety that you find if you actually read the detailed answers, right? So I'm going to show you some distributions of the responses. So go ahead and submit your votes, but it's worth going and looking at all the thought people put into the answers, to the written responses. Okay, so again, we start with question 1 with something that is an empirical question, and you'll see panelists often appeal to the literature. They may also comment on their own confidence or knowledge in the subject. Different people have different dispositions. Some are willing to give sort of a layperson's opinion if they don't have specific knowledge of literature, or even run some quick regressions to comment on it. And other people are happy, like me, I think, to give a gut response sometimes, regardless. So, okay, so we have an interesting split here. And before looking at what our panelists said, let's go to question 2, which is more public holidays. So do you think, so now, as in the pattern I mentioned earlier, this is actually a actionable policy question, right? We could increase the number of public holidays. And this is, I mean, in some sense, this is, well, this is maybe related to a labor econ kind of labor policy question that non-wellbeing economists are thinking about. But really, public holidays are a fairly deep part of our society structure. They're quite invasive. It's a pretty strong instrument to turn off a lot of commerce, and so so this is a good kind of thing that a well-being poll may ask, right? Okay, so go ahead and give your response to the second one. And for the rest of the talk, if you're bored with me, you can just be going and reading everybody's answers. So this is kind of interesting. So now let me show you what happened in our poll. So the first question, we maybe quite similar, I think, to the audience now. We had a fair bit of disagreement, right? So there were a lot of people who agreed, but there are a lot of people who pointed out all of the literature on two things, I guess. One is the stress of for those who don't have connections. So in some sense, people are making comparisons to those who have better holiday circumstances than their own, better connections and family events and so on. And the other is that as if mindsets, and this is maybe specific to Christmas in particular, but when mindsets turn towards consumption, then that can also generally make people less happy. And yet when we came to the policy question of should we have more of them, there was actually fairly strong agreement that we should have more holidays. So you can go again and look at the details of what people's thinking was there. But it's quite interesting to look at the difference between the empirical evidence we have on something and then the much broader people's extrapolation to the concrete policy questions. Okay, here is another. In my country, individuals who continue in education, so this is the one I gave you earlier, but now you can give your answer. So people with more education obtain higher lifetime well-being. So I already gave you some mention. I'm sure many of you know this literature as well as I. But what would your take on this be? Okay, and the second question is, adding a year of compulsory education would increase national well-being. So again, this is policy that's of course happened in some places even where there are enough data to study it. But it's something that we could still think about, and is probably a very relevant question nowadays with structural changes in the labor market and technology. And I think people may have already started answering Q2, but if not, go ahead and do it now. Depends on the cohort. That's intriguing. Okay, so we get a good mixture. So I'll go on to what the poll gave us. Again, people agree with this about this counterfactual, but there was plenty of disagreement and plenty of agnosticism on the policy question. Okay, let's move on again. Here is a question. So I think this one's a little bit weird. I'll ask for your input again on this one, and maybe a couple of more in a moment. Go ahead. So the rise in global inflation will impact negatively on the well-being of the majority of people in affected countries. So this is from the recent round of inflation. And sorry, this question I don't find weird. The next one. So agree, disagree. So we've got a mix with a weight towards agree. And the second question is that policy responses to combat the rise in global inflation will impact negatively on the well-being of the majority of people in affected countries. And what I think is weird about this is that we're not specifying the policy. In some sense, we know what those policy responses are, and I go ahead. Now, this is, of course, from post-pandemic a few years ago, so it's interesting to look back as on what's gone on, and we've got a spread. So, I mean, part of part of the point and the mystique maybe about this kind of economics poll is that economists have this reputation for never agreeing on anything. So here's what, again, we have fairly strong agreement on the inflation having a negative impact. That's probably not hard. And then mixture, but generally the sense that our responses to inflation is also going to negatively impact people. Those are consistent. So just on this idea that economists don't agree, I mean, we could be choosing questions that are going to be difficult or are going to create debate. One thing, if you go and look at this, what I mentioned is an inspiration for this kind of poll. In some sense, it's a response to the policy polls that are focusing on other outcomes of policy, in particular on economic growth and so on, the canonical measures of policy outcome. And here's an example inspired by the current election madness in the US. And I would say that it's so this is not our poll. This is US economic policy poll run by the Clark Center for Global Markets at the University of Chicago. And all these three of these questions, well, I'm not showing you the answers actually, but they're all fairly unanimous, right? So in some sense, they are using this poll, I think, as a public communication mechanism to show that, economists are actually fairly settled on these things. So for all of the misinformation and, an environment of a lot of conspiracy and misinformation and so on, one thing that these polls can be used for is actually to show when there is consensus. I think that's something, I've only been on this management committee a short while, but that's something we could think about doing, is actually targeting questions for strong consensus. Sometimes we only have one question. So here is, like many others, it's worth going and reading the detailed answers. But on balance, I expect well-designed, legalized euthanasia and assisted dying policies to improve the overall well-being of society. And I'm just going to move forward now without listing your responses on each one. But here, interestingly, we had, again, strong agreement. So this was, I don't know if this was the intent or expectation of the management committee to make a statement of support from well-being economists in some sense, but that's the outcome here. Here's another one. I found this interesting as again, an actionable policy is that public broadcasters should put more attention on positive or happy news stories to improve national well-being. This is the second question in a poll of 2. And actually, there was a lot of support for this, but an interesting range of opinions. And here's one other example of a pair of questions. Decriminalization of drugs initiatives around the world these last 20 years have on balance delivered well-being gains for their populations. That is again in principle a causal question, so, implying a counterfactual. And then we force you over to answer a concrete policy question, which is that further decriminalization can be expected to lead to net well-being gains in the population. And here's what we found. Support for the past and indeed support among this cohort for continued decriminalization. Interestingly, this was a couple of years ago. In my country, there's certainly debate now about some of the harm reduction approaches having being a bit too blunt, maybe, I guess needing complementary policies, if not being slightly misguided. So without revealing what the next question is, this Friday, we will, for the first time in the history of the poll, be repeating a question. So that's something we can start to do now with 7 years of history, is to look at how things have changed over time. Okay, there's one last category of all questions I think that are interesting, which I'm going to go over, but I thought this was an interesting way to look at the whole history. So this is every poll that we've had, and in general, I think there's a little bit more of the green than the red, and I'm not sure if that's a response bias or our question framing bias. But you can see that from this distribution, the number of cases where there is strong agreement amongst the panel, and where there's a lot of diversity in opinions. Okay, so I've tried to focus so far just to show you that we're asking questions about concrete policy. We also have quite a few times where we have asked something that is a little fuzzier and more in all of the philosophical and measurement kind of questions that we inevitably deal with in this field. So here's one that I deal with a lot in talking to policymakers in Canada, is whether subjective well-being is merely a reflection of mental health. I mean, I don't deal with that directly, but it's gets at this question related in Q2 here, which is that well-being policy is best situated as part of health policy. So these are maybe not the best kind of questions for public consumption, in that they don't relate to a hot topic in the news. They're a little bit more policy wonkish. But we actually had fairly strong opinion against both of these, but again, with some interesting diversity. And here's another rather philosophical question, and yet this one is really quite critical to actually implementing well-being frameworks. And so this says, if government were considering this is the second question, and it's trying to find something, again, an actionable policy. But if government were considering the closure of an IVF clinic, a fertility clinic, they need not count the foregone well-being of unborn IVF, meaning in vitro fertilization. They need not count the foregone well-being of unborn IVF children because those children are never born. So you might think that that researchers have a somewhat common view to handle this kind of angels on the head of a pin question, which is nevertheless probably sounds fairly cut and dry, but you've got to go and look at what people say. We have opinions across the board. And another one that's, again, really fundamental to policy, and yet this is framed in a fairly abstract way. From the perspective of assessing overall human welfare, family and community well-being are best thought of as determinants of individual life satisfaction rather than as distinct dimensions of well-being. I'm guessing most of you are familiar with how this language is meant. Connell Smith actually led the development of this in order to help inform the OECD's deliberations right now for revised recommendations of measuring subjective well-being for central government statistical agencies. So here, a determinant of well-being we think of as something that is causal for maybe a scalar outcome, whereas referring to distinct dimensions of well-being appeals more to the idea, which is common, I would say, historically amongst psychologists as opposed to economists, that we probably can't reduce quality of life, or the quality of experience down to a scalar, down to a single dimension. And so we actually should have multiple metrics without an overarching one if you want to describe well-being. And the second part of those of this pair is that if public policy targets measures of individual life satisfaction, it will also necessarily capture all the important drivers of collective well-being. So this debate, which is very important, relates also to whether we have concepts in this field that are really appropriate to populations around the world across different cultures, or whether we need to, in more collectivist cultures, we need to actually be measuring something that is not captured by the sum of the parts. Okay, and just flipping through those, you can see that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. People have different views. Okay, just before I wrap up, I want to advertise one other thing that we did a couple of years ago. I say we, not me. In fact, so this was this was also generated by the panel by asking people for 5 of the most important papers in the field, and then votes were tallied, and so we released a reading list of 24 papers that were ordered by votes. And I think this is an interesting occasion for me. It's a way to sort of look maybe at the history. It's just sort of like doing a literature review, but to look at the history of our field. So I'll just flip through all of them and try to not feel the need to say something about each of them. But interestingly, the oldest is also the first on the list, meaning was ranked the most important. And that's really, in some sense, I think where economists have first really gained attention for this field. And the first paper in economics using a self-reported happiness question. In time, not in ranking, Diener's subjective well-being, which was his first paper in subjective well-being, and it was review. By the way, we actually dedicated the July 2021 World Wellbeing Panel question to his memory shortly after he died. And the next is also a Diener paper, which has been. I said I'm not going to try and speak about each of these. So how do I? Yeah. So I think this has been important in connecting psychologist, psychometric and economic approaches to subjective well-being. That's one way I would describe the importance of the satisfaction with life scale, which is, you know, a multi-question version of the single life satisfaction question. Here's the happiness is everything, or is it? So this connects, empirically estimates the importance of 6 dimensions. Again, this is connecting a psychological approach in explaining life satisfaction. Here, I think this Clark and Oswald paper is where the word happiness was first used in an economics journal in a title. And as now, it's used in a sort of in a fairly broad, with a broad meaning. And there was a lot of, you know, after the relative income emphasis in economics, there was a lot of early emphasis on unemployment. That's something that was measurable and repeated quite a number of times. And so those are the first 2 macroeconomic variables that really were able to be looked at. Easterlin's follow-up paper, which really spelled out the changing of material norms. Another Oswald paper, and this is an early case where economists argued for the use of happiness by policymakers. Kahn, Walker, and Sarin paper back to Bentham. So this is where the idea of decision and experienced utility was explained to economists who, in my view, I think this is still very salient, still conflate these and are not trained in thinking about these concepts separately. Here's another very influential paper about the negative impact of unemployment being large. And I don't want to go over, so I'm going to skip through the rest of these, but I encourage you, if you go to the website, you can go and see our write-up for all of these, and it's a really fun romp through history. You can make sure you've read them all. You can use them for your course if you're teaching on this stuff, or assign them to your students. And there's just one other thing I want to mention, which is actually not about the World Wellbeing Panel, but it's in the same vein. And it's a collection of policy shorts, short videos on policy. So the assignment was for academics in our field to create a video of 4 minutes or less in which they articulate for their favorite well-being policy. So if you could enact one policy to improve well-being, what would it be? And maybe give some evidence for why. So you can see some familiar names there. In fact, Paul Freiter's overachieved and contributed 3 different policies in this. But my hope, this is back in 2021, my hope was that this would grow somehow. So I would love to find a way. I mean, there's some really great stuff there. Here are some examples, by the way. Housing First, community cooking lessons, children's mental health, not surprisingly, heavy restrictions on advertising, shorter work week, underrepresented workers, social prescribing, healthy minds again. I think it's really important for us to, by the way, one interesting thing is that not everybody who is invited to do this felt comfortable, right? So there are people in our field who actually don't think that they have, despite being experts in the empirical analysis, in causal identification, don't feel that they have prescription, that they have something to actually normative to say to policymakers. But it's a really good exercise. And going back to these 2 goals of getting academics to think about policy and getting policymakers to think about well-being, I'd love to find a way to continue to expand this database of videos, maybe through maybe events or maybe in an ongoing way. And so that brings me just to wrap up and turn it over to discussion. The mandate for the World Wellbeing Panel is quite broad, as I told you at the beginning. So we could think about doing other activities than what we're doing. But there's plenty of other ways you can contribute by, for instance, suggesting questions to us. And if you have ideas for how we could, leverage, amplify our findings, that will also be great. We don't tend to get a lot of discussion on Twitter, say, after every poll, as I think the founders dreamt that we would. And I also mentioned this idea, how could we, is it possible, is there a way to expand the poll in the future to maybe have regional panels or something? I think at the moment a more relevant goal is to really encourage people from countries where we don't have representation yet. If you think of somebody like that, please speak up, because it's pretty critical for the policy side of the field right now that we have perspectives from as many cultures as possible when we're making grandiose statements about well-being comparisons and well-being policy. And that's it. I look forward to any discussion we can have.
Thank you very much, Chris. So everyone, you have some questions that Chris has for you, if you have ideas there, or if you have questions for Chris, please raise your virtual hands, or you can write in the chat. And it looks like we have our first question from Ansha. Ansha, you're welcome to ask yourself if you'd like, or I can read it out for you. Just give you a second to respond. And Miles, you'll go next. I'll go ahead and read Ansha's question. So it says, "Hi, Christopher. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. Could you please tell us more about who answers these questions, or who gets the invitation to answer them? Also, what is the role of the current panelists? You may have already said it, but are you making the data available for scientific use?"
Data available for
scientific use.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, I managed to avoid the question of how people get invited, except to say that the criteria are significant contributions in the field, and that we get around to thinking of you and thinking of adding to the poll, especially if our numbers are dwindling. Which, as I said, well, I don't think there's any limit. So there, we don't have a constitution. I don't think there's anything particularly admirable about this process, because it's 4 people sitting on this management committee, racking their brains who's already got a significant profile in the community, and we want them on this panel. And I suppose, and so to be honest about this, when the panel started out, there were a lot of very well recognizable names there, even people who hadn't contributed any research in the field, because the idea was really to compete for attention in some sense with these other economic policy panels. So when I took over, I did a cull of some of the names who had never contributed, and then ones who had not contributed in quite a while, who had gone quiet. And I don't know what to say, except I mean, these things are always subjective, and I'm open to suggestions if there's a better process, but it's pretty untransparent right now. If I think maybe the best thing to say would be that we should also accept self-nominations, right? If you want to be on the panel and are already let's just say established as a researcher in the field, and you're waiting for an invitation, write to us. Did I answer Chris, the second part first?
Let's just clarify real quick.
Oh,
sorry.
Share the data, yeah.
So Ansha, he's saying how the panelists become panelists, but then it's the panelists who are answering these questions. So the survey is sent out to them, and they're the people who answer. One other related question would be, what's your approximate response rate of the panelists from survey to survey? But then I also, sorry, I skipped, yeah, Ansh's last part, which is the scientific use.
Good question. I would say 50%. Not sure. So yeah, we have 58, and then we could look at the numbers from some of the recent ones, and I think we probably have 20, 25. You know, unlike the if you go and look at the other economic policy panels, there are a lot more of those people. So actually, the panels are more frequent. I don't know what the response rate is, but many people don't give a detailed answer. So you can just click your agree, disagree, and go home, or move on. And that's not the norm in this panel. So it is a little bit more effort to give response. And so if people don't feel like they're expert on a particular topic or don't have a time, you know, don't keep up, then they may not answer. The data are in a database in the back end of this website, and I've just exported them all in order to make some of the slides I showed you. So if somebody, yeah, I mean, maybe don't need to be proactive about it. If somebody wants the data, I would be happy to share them. But if you go to worldwellbeingpanel.org, you can see everything, and there's nothing hidden there. It's just it's not in a single file. You can see everything.
Thanks. Miles, your question? You can unmute yourself.
First of all, I'd be happy to be on the panel. But the other thing that is interesting to me is in terms of things to ask the panel, I think it sounds like many of the questions have been kind of substantive questions, and our team, Dan and Ori and I and Kristen have been really quite focused on methodological questions, and I'd certainly be very curious to know where people are at methodologically. So for example, one question is there's the use of vignettes or calibration questions to try to deal with scale use differences. How do people feel about that? Do they feel it, do they feel it's important? And it's, is it important to include those kinds of vignettes or calibration questions on surveys and so on? Anyway, that's one example of a methodological question, but there are a lot of other ones that, yeah.
Thanks, Miles. So I should have said you can do more than suggest a question. So so far this has been, if you are on the panel, you can actually also suggest a question and offer to write up the synthesis of the responses. So you'll see now in any of our recent polls that there's somebody who's given credit for the poll. That means that they did the write-up, and then the rest of the management committee, which helped and with editing and so on, get secondary credit. So so you can actually lead one of these now. This is very interesting, and I mean, I think I don't have a strong direction here as far as what our most use is, right? There's an internal one where A, navel gazing, B, trying to well, let's just call it internally focused, where we're doing this kind of thing. And I think if we asked methodological questions like those, that would be very important. We may get slightly less response rate. And that's a different goal from trying to promote ultimately attention outside of academia. So I think these are equally laudable goals, and I'm not sure that we are explicit anywhere in what exactly what we're supposed to be doing. So I think that's great, and I'd love to talk, get more ideas about questions.
All right, thank you. We have a comment from Ashley saying, given the old saying that all politics is local, it might be more impactful to have regional polls with a similar issue so that there would be more comparative data. It probably means that the questions would be more macro to facilitate comparisons, but for media purposes, local questions are appropriate.
So that sounds like the original aspiration. I'm not sure how we do that, except by having a much larger panel. But we could ask, we could ask questions that were just focused in topic, much more focused in topic on a region, and know that we would have a smaller response rate.
Conversely, if you take issues like, I don't know, immigration, there would be a regional domain, but you could break it down so you'd have a regional panel for Europe and one for the United States or North America, right? And then probably some continental analogs in Asia. And then you'd be able to both compare and they'd be locally relevant.
We have compared regions with, in the analysis of responses. So there were, I'm trying to think which question it was now, where there was a significant difference in people's answers from European respondents and North American respondents. If we go beyond those regions, we just have very small numbers on the poll right now. So
yeah.
So is your suggestion? Well, would more frequently splitting up the responses by region within our current panel fit your suggestion?
Well, I think it means if you want, logically, you might actually have to make the panel somewhat larger so that you could accommodate some of those regions. Because you're putting a real burden on those 5 respondents from one locale. Because you said your universe was around 50, so you end up with some limitations there. So you probably have to augment the sample so that you'd be able to do it. But then you would. I'm just thinking, going back to your saying about policy impact. Well, there's 2 levels of policy impact. Either it's more current, so then you need questions that are relevant to the immediate date, or are anticipatory. Now, you could use the poll in more of a Delphi sense to anticipate what would be the issues that would be impacting on well-being by region, and then follow it up with a second one that asks about policy alternatives. Anyway, I'm just sorry, I don't mean to dominate.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. There's a supply, there's a supply problem for expanding the poll. We could, and then there's, and then there's a bit of also on our side. The effort would scale if we came up with a new platform, right? So we could really open things up in some way. I'm not sure how exactly, but we could just not have a fixed membership and ask questions to maybe still within the academic community, but much more broadly open. That maybe wouldn't require too much overhead. Anyway, that's interesting. Thank you very much for those ideas.
Chris, I have a quick question. I hope relevant for everyone. Have you had any interaction with the policy community? And so what I'm thinking is, you run this idea by somebody who is maybe favorable towards us, like Gus O'Donnell, or others, or have you seen any take up in policy communications, national wellbeing frameworks, or let's say OECD? So has there been any reference to us thus far?
Can anybody else answer that? Because otherwise my answer is going to be not that I know of. Which I'm not proud of, either the answer or the lack of certainty, lack of knowledge. Yeah, I think in the Canadian government actually answered this question to somebody, yes, to a internal McGill reporter. I think my contacts in the Canadian government know about it, but it hasn't shown up in any of their documentation, and I can't make any direct links. Yeah. If anybody else knows, yeah. And as I said, we don't have a great way to track this right now. If there were news shots if there were news hits every, by the way, we have a poll every couple of months on average. If you average over the last 7 years, it's been every 2 months or so. if there was news, then I guess we would be able to quantify that, relatively easily with a Google tracker. There's so little that we can't track zero.
I don't take this as a failure. I just take it as something to strive for. And the panel's been around for a while, but it's always evolving. So I think that's okay. And then you have a question from Ansha, or something else that she would be interested in. So another question for the poll. So it would be interesting to know to what extent places where people live shape their subjective well-being. Answer these kinds of questions would help design cities or regions in a way that is conducive to subjective well-being. So I would say maybe aspects of where people live and or community well-being, aspects of community well-being can then be used on a more localized level.
So I can envision a question that is asking our panel, to what extent we can boost well-being through interventions in urban form or something like that. Is that where you're going?
That makes sense to me. Although, Anka, if you feel like muting yourself, you're welcome to do so.
So hi, yeah, basically, I was thinking about something like place attachment. So what does people attach to places, and what is based, and not in a positive way. So there are many negative aspects to place attachment, yeah, responsibilities or something, but what is special for people in places, and what can we do about that? I mean, I don't think only about cities. I also think about rural areas. I think about like everything, basically. I mean, there must be some specific question regarding rural areas, urban areas, but yeah, I think there are some places where people have higher well-being just because the city is, I don't know, like it is, whatever it is. I would be more interested in knowing this, and maybe it's worth it to explore.
Thanks. So just to clarify, I can imagine, well, I'm not sure I can formulate, but I can imagine there being questions addressing that, which one puts on a survey to a large population. For the panel, the question would more be, I mean, what we're usually asking people to do in question one is their own literature review, right? So we would ask them about whether such effects exist and have everybody give their assessment of the literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so,
for example, yeah.
Okay. We still have a little bit of time if we go over, if anyone else has a question or an idea for the panel. Personally, I see this as one way in which the community can reach out further. It's really a great opportunity. And it's organized by us as opposed to by the OECD or some sort of external body. So, I drank the Kool-Aid, if you will. But it's a good opportunity now to provide some feedback. Any other comments or questions? So I would ask Chris, so what's the best way for people to ask questions or self-nominate themselves or provide feedback? Is there a way to do that directly through the website, or do they send you an email? What's the best way to provide some feedback?
Send me an email. I think we just give my email as the contact on each of our results reports. By the way, it looks from the documentation or the references that we're supposed to have a distribution email list as well as the panel. And right now we're only sending out the reports of each poll to the panel itself, and I'm asking them to distribute it. There's not a lot of resources to build new infrastructure right now, but we should. I mean, if you would like to receive what we send out as soon as the report is released, you can also email me, and I'll just maybe at the moment make a list of people who want to be on that distribution list, because I don't think we have one. Yeah, so email me is the answer to all those questions. And one thing I'm taking away from today, I mean, if looking back on 7 years, this was a chance to reflect, even though I'm new to this position. If we're being useful on the internal channel, the reflective channel, rather than being useful influencing policymakers, then I think that's something to take seriously. And I mean, as I said, some of our questions are already like that, but I think both of these objectives are legitimate. And so there may be, while I said at the beginning that there were two purposes here, to get well-being economists to think about policy and to get policymakers to think about well-being, maybe there's a third where it's really just taking the pulse of our own, the evolution of science and methods, as Miles mentioned, within our own community, and that's valuable unto itself.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think that's a great place to close. So thank you very much, Christopher. And the attendees, I very much appreciate your participation. We'll be back in a few weeks. Thank you again. Have a good afternoon, evening, whatever it may be.
Thanks so much to everybody for the ideas, and thank you very much, Kelsey.